Thank you. It's good to be here this morning. Yes, I've spent a lot of time thinking about whether or not there are shortages in STEM, and a fair amount of time looking at the immigrant side of that, but also what is called the pipeline. That is the number of students coming through the process. And there, over 4 decades, a lot of the basic things we learn about the STEM labor market, the pipeline, don't seem to be true. About a third, in recent years, even more of incoming freshmen are interested in STEM. There's not been a loss of interest. Test taking has actually improved. The number of courses being taken at the high school level have improved. In the United States, we're often concerned about how poorly we seem to do on international tests like the PISA and whatnot. Having said that, we have in the United States about a third of the top 2 quintile performing students on international tests on science. So that's kind of an important fact because the numbers are exactly the way Steve said. If you look at a high school cohort, about 4% at the end will end up with a STEM degree. Maybe 2.5% will actually end up in a STEM job. That's amazing, isn't it? 2.5% out of a graduating high school class. So if we have a third of the world's highly qualified by test students in the United States at the high school level, we've got plenty of ability to supply the pipeline. What we need is a correct set of signals going all the way down the pipeline to make that happen. Now, I'll be talking this afternoon at a different venue. Clearly, there's a lot we need to do to improve the STEM pipeline. Clearly, we need to reach out to minorities and bring underrepresented minorities and women into STEM. There's a lot of challenges, so I'm not saying that the STEM pipeline doesn't have issues, but the potential is really there. As for the indicator of shortages in the labor market, you do get these kind of disconcerting things that we just heard about, which is, large numbers of individuals with degrees who aren't actually working in STEM jobs. And that one's kind of a trickier nut for lots of different reasons. One of the things I hadn't seen, though, was what Steve also said. 700,000 arrivals over better than a decade of foreigners with STEM degrees.
Well, that's 2009 to 2012, or 2007 to 2012.
2007. Only 1/3 are actually working in STEM, 1/3 are working outside of STEM, and 1/3 are not working at all, which is kind of amazing. It is a fairly inefficient system for supplying the STEM labor market. And that little factoid alone is something I want to investigate a lot more carefully. Let me just kind of make some of the comments on this. So one of the things people are saying is they look at the data. Wages aren't growing, employment isn't growing that rapidly, so it doesn't seem to be a lot of shortage. And people have started redefining what it means to be STEM. And in that context, you've got STEM everywhere. 4% of agricultural workers employ math, and so therefore they're STEM. Physics degree holders driving taxis earn more than other taxi drivers, so clearly they're using their skills. I think it's a slippery slope empirically to start moving our definition of what it means to be STEM. I don't think STEM is everywhere. When we're educating people for STEM, I think we want them to get STEM jobs by and large. When we're admitting foreign workers to be in STEM, we want them to work in STEM. So why is the perception there? You've heard some from Steve. Let me point out a few others, one of which, and some of these I think are very well-intentioned viewpoints. And the well-intention of the viewpoint is so strong that a lot of the data points are brushed aside. One of those is I read a piece written in 1900 about somebody who said we have to train everybody in science. This is at a time when 8% of the U.S. population had a high school degree. Everybody should be trained in science because in a modern world, you have to have science to be able to participate in politics. You have to understand how the world works. So the science citizenry perspective is out there, and it has a lot of legs. The other is innovation, which is part and parcel of this idea that all education is good. Even though we've got, I hate to say it, some reasonable suggestions that we almost overeducate our population. So this mismatch between degree and job isn't necessarily unique to STEM. We need to rethink how we do education in the United States fairly thoroughly. Part of the concern here is also what I'd call U.S. dominance, what Bhagwati called America's fear of being a diminished giant. And so the idea is if you throw enough STEM at it, the economy will grow. I'm not a supply sider in that way. I think if there's not demand, you can't just grow an economy by increasing level education. It's a fine marriage between the two. So why do we have these perceptions otherwise? Well, employers clearly have a vested interest, but it's not clear to me that they often see that's why they're acting. In other words, they look out there and they say it's hard to find these workers. And sure it is. It's hard to find highly skilled workers. That's true. But when you look at the same surveys, you know what's interesting? Employers say, I can't find people with soft skills, who work in teams, who can write, who can do a memo, who can think well. In other words, our education system isn't producing the soft skills that employers often are looking for. We're not talking technical skills. And you can see that most interestingly, especially in IT, where a large proportion of the labor force has no STEM background and they're working in this field. They've picked up the skills along the way in some other ways. They're getting it through certificates, but they bring the right combination of soft and programming skills to the employer. Employers don't train anymore. There is a culture of expectations about just in time, and that's changed. There's also perils of training. You train them, and they can command a better job someplace else, and they do. It's a very mobile, high turnover labor market. And you can see this when people talk about vacancies. Vacancies are large. One of the interesting factoids in 2000, ITAA came out with an estimate of 400,000 vacancies in IT. And so we need more H-1Bs, right? Bill Lehrman over at the Urban Institute did some calculations. He said, well, that's just frictional unemployment. It's frictional turnover. In other words, you would expect a certain amount of vacancies as employers try to fill those positions. So the data's often kind of difficult to see, and behind that are different stratagems that employers are using in the labor market. The other part of this is the academics whose jobs is to produce and get tuition dollars. We have a system at NIH that rewards large grant holders using postdocs. We have today close to 150,000 OPT workers in the United States. We have fundamentally changed the nature of how foreign students work and get into the labor market and into the economy in the United States, and that deserves a lot of thought. Well, I could go on, but I'm approaching 10 minutes, I believe.
Oh, if you have more to say, go ahead.
Well, so, I just want to say that, why foreign workers then? Why? And some of the reasons are fairly obvious. Because there is a widespread perception of shortages for the reasons I just mentioned, because of inertia in business models, because we're not really talking about all Ls or all H-1Bs or all green carders. It's a segmented market. Different employers act in different ways. They really have different motivations. And the other thing that's important is when you go to college fairs, you've got very bright foreign graduates staring you in the face. Employers would like to employ them. The labor market's become both global and very intensively international within the U.S. So these things are a lot of the reasons why employers and others want to hire foreign workers. Going forward, I'm not going to offer a lot of policy advice, but I do think that we have a few factoids, again, that I think many of us think would produce better outcomes. One of which is that permanent visa programs probably are better than temporary. Temporary programs, if kept small and targeted towards specific employers, would serve their intended purpose of meeting cyclical shortages, and that not only should be permitted, it should be facilitated. And we should think about creative ways of doing that. We need to spend a lot of attention on how we manage the transition between foreign student and permanent visa status in the United States. There's been a lot of policy proposals there. I think they're well intended, but we've got to think about the management because it's not easy to do it right. We know how the Australians didn't do it right. And when the day is done, supply is still an issue. If there's no clear shortage indicators, then large-scale permanent or temporary probably doesn't make too much difference. There is some tipping point, and how we figure out where that tipping point is important to how it sends signals out to the labor market on other underrepresented minorities and others in the domestic pipeline.